Every major religious tradition has attempted to answer the same haunting question: why does evil exist? Not philosophical evil, but the tangible darkness that manifests in human cruelty, systemic oppression, and the persistent pull towards self-destruction. The Judeo-Christian tradition, spanning over 3,000 years of written record, developed a complex answer involving names that still echo through modern consciousness: Lucifer, Beelzebub, Belial. But here is what makes this fascinating from a historical and textual perspective. These names did not emerge fully formed. They evolved through centuries of cultural contact, theological reflection, and interpretative tradition. Each name carries layers of meaning that reveal as much about the societies that shaped them as about the spiritual realities they attempted to describe. Consider Lucifer. The prophet Isaiah, writing in the 8th century before Christ, composed a taunt song against the Babylonian king. In Hebrew, he used the phrase Helel ben Shachar, meaning shining one, son of the dawn. This was political poetry, comparing the king's fall from power to a morning star descending from the sky. When Jerome translated the Hebrew Bible into Latin during the 4th century after Christ, he rendered this phrase as Lucifer, Latin for light-bearer. It was only through later allegorical interpretation, heavily influenced by intertestamental texts like the Book of Enoch, that this passage about a human king became reinterpreted as the fall of a rebellious angel. The Book of Enoch, dated to around the 3rd century before Christ, expanded dramatically on brief biblical references to fallen angels, creating elaborate narratives that would influence Jewish and Christian thought for centuries. Beelzebub presents an equally intriguing evolution. In 2 Kings chapter 1, we encounter Baal-Zebub as the god of Ekron, a Philistine city. Scholars believe the original name was likely Baal-Zebul, meaning Lord of the Heights or Prince Lord. Hebrew scribes, in an act of sophisticated theological polemic, altered the name slightly so it sounded like Lord of Flies, deliberately associating the rival deity with decay and impurity. By the time Jesus appears in the Gospels, particularly in Matthew chapter 12, verses 24 through 28, Beelzebub had accumulated centuries of symbolic meaning. When Jesus is accused of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub, identified as Prince of Demons, the name carried the full weight of its complex history. Belial follows yet another trajectory. In the earliest Hebrew texts, Belial was not a proper name, but a compound word meaning worthlessness or without profit. When ancient texts spoke of sons of Belial, they simply meant worthless people, rebels who rejected moral and divine authority. The first book of Samuel, chapters 2 and 8, uses this expression to describe corrupt individuals. However, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered at Qumran in 1947, Belial emerges as a personified apocalyptic figure, leader of the forces of darkness in cosmic war against the sons of light. The War Scroll, one of the most significant Qumran texts, describes elaborate battles between these spiritual armies, with Belial commanding the forces of evil. What you are examining is not mere religious curiosity. This is textual archaeology, tracing how concepts of good and evil, light and darkness, order and chaos were refined through millennia of human experience, collective suffering, and the search for meaning. Each name represents an attempt by ancient communities to understand and categorize forces that seem to oppose everything good, just, and sacred. The Church Fathers, including Justin Martyr, Irenaeus of Lyons, Origen of Alexandria, and Athanasius of Alexandria, wrote extensively about these figures between the 2nd and 4th centuries after Christ. Their interpretations, based on the Greek Septuagint and oral traditions stretching back centuries, shaped Christian understanding of spiritual reality. Subscribe to this channel, because what follows will fundamentally challenge everything you thought you knew about the origin of evil. the nature of temptation, and the hidden history behind names that humanity has feared for millennia. The earliest Hebrew scriptures present a theological puzzle that most modern readers never notice. The concept of a unified cosmic enemy of God does not appear in the way contemporary religious imagination assumes. The transformation of this concept, occurring over nearly a millennium of theological reflection and historical trauma, provides one of the most fascinating case studies in how religious ideas evolve in response to cultural contact and existential crisis. When modern readers encounter the word Satan in English translations of the Bible, they automatically import centuries of developed theology, imagining a fallen angel leading demonic rebellion against divine authority. But the Hebrew texts from which these translations derive tell a more nuanced and historically complex story. The word Satan in biblical Hebrew functions grammatically as a common noun, meaning adversary or opposer, derived from a verbal root meaning to obstruct or oppose. The Book of Job, likely composed between the 6th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, provides the earliest substantial portrayal of Hey Satan, literally the Satan or the adversary. In chapter 1, verses 6 through 12, the text describes a scene that would be jarring to readers expecting the cosmic rebel of later tradition. The sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Hey Satan also came among them. There is no indication of rebellion, exile, or cosmic warfare. Satan appears as a member in good standing of the divine council, with a specific bureaucratic function, testing human integrity. When God draws Satan's attention to Job as a man of perfect integrity who fears God and turns away from evil, Satan responds not with rebellious defiance, but with a procedural question that seems to fall within his designated role. Does Job fear God for nothing? Remove his blessings, and he will surely curse you to your face. This is a challenge, certainly, but one made within the accepted protocols of celestial administration. God grants permission for the test, setting limits on what Hey Satan may do, and Hey Satan proceeds to execute the authorized action. This functional understanding of Satan appears also in the prophet Zechariah, writing around 518 before the Common Era. Chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, presents Satan standing beside the high priest Joshua to accuse him before the angel of the Lord. But the angel rebukes him. The Lord rebuke you, Satan. The figure can be corrected when overstepping bounds, suggesting operation within an established hierarchy rather than as cosmic rebel. So what historical forces drove the transformation from this bureaucratic accuser to the cosmic adversary that dominates later religious imagination? The answer lies in one of the most traumatic periods of ancient Israelite history, the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem and the subsequent exile that lasted nearly 70 years. In 586 before the Common Era, Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon destroyed Solomon's temple and deported Judah's political, religious, and intellectual elite to Mesopotamia. This catastrophe was not merely military defeat, but existential theological crisis. The central institution of Israelite religion lay in ruins. The Davidic monarchy, promised by God to last forever, had ended. The people chosen by God to be a light to the nations found themselves captive in a foreign land, their faith tested by devastating questions about divine power, justice, and faithfulness. During the approximately 70 years of exile, and subsequently under Persian rule after Cyrus the Great issued his decree of liberation in 538 before the Common Era, the Jewish community underwent profound theological development. Exposure to Babylonian and Persian religious systems, particularly Zoroastrianism, introduced concepts that would reshape Israelite thought about the nature of evil, cosmic conflict, and eschatological destiny. Zoroastrianism, founded by the prophet Zarathustra, probably between 1600 and 1000 before the Common Era, presented a sophisticated dualistic cosmology. At its center stood Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of light, truth and order, in eternal conflict with Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit of darkness, falsehood and chaos. This was not simply a matter of a celestial functionary questioning human motives, but cosmic warfare between fundamental forces operating at the deepest levels of reality. Scholars designate the period between the last Hebrew Bible text, Malachi, written around 430 before the Common Era, and the emergence of New Testament writings in the 1st century of the Common Era as the intertestamental period. During these approximately 400 years, Jewish thought underwent dramatic transformation. Apocalyptic literature flourished, developing elaborate cosmologies, angelologies, and demonologies that would profoundly influence emerging Christianity. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 1947 and 1956 in caves near Qumran, provide direct textual evidence of this transformation. These manuscripts, produced by a Jewish community living between approximately 2nd century before the Common Era and 1st century of the Common Era, contain apocalyptic texts describing cosmic warfare between sons of light and sons of darkness, led by Belial, who had evolved from a descriptive term meaning worthlessness into a proper name designating the chief adversary of God. But what exactly did texts like the Book of Enoch contain that was so revolutionary it permanently altered how humanity understood the conflict between good and evil? And why did some communities preserve it as sacred scripture while others excluded it entirely from their biblical canons? The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls between 1947 and 1956 represents one of the most significant archaeological finds in human history for understanding the development of religious thought during the intertestamental period. Among the approximately 900 manuscripts recovered from 11 caves near the ancient settlement of Qumran, multiple copies of the Book of Enoch were found preserved in Aramaic and Hebrew, providing direct textual evidence that this apocalyptic work held authoritative status for at least some Jewish communities during the last centuries before the Common Era. The Book of Enoch is not a single unified text, but a composite work consisting of at least 5 distinct sections compiled over several centuries. The oldest and most influential section, the Book of the Watchers, likely dates to the 3rd century before the Common Era and addresses one of the most cryptic passages in Genesis. Chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, contains a narrative that has puzzled interpreters for millennia. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful and married any of them they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. The canonical biblical text provides only these minimal details before moving quickly to the flood narrative. The Book of Enoch, however, transforms these few enigmatic verses into an elaborate cosmic drama of angelic rebellion, forbidden knowledge, and divine judgment. According to this text, 200 angels called Watchers descended to Mount Hermon under the leadership of Semyaza. There they swore a binding oath, fully aware they were violating established celestial order to take human wives and produce offspring. The text meticulously lists the names of 20 principal leaders and associates, each with specific forbidden teachings that corrupted antediluvian civilization. Azazel taught humans the art of metallurgy, weapon-making, cosmetics, precious stones, and dyes. Semyaza taught enchantments and the cutting of roots. Almaros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakel taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught knowledge of clouds. Arachiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. This transfer of celestial knowledge to unprepared humanity is presented as fundamental transgression. The text suggests certain knowledge belongs exclusively to the divine realm, and its premature revelation precipitated moral and spiritual catastrophe. The Nephilim, offspring of these forbidden unions, grew to monstrous sizes. Some versions describe them reaching 300 cubits in height. They consumed all human agricultural production, and when resources were exhausted, they began devouring animals, and eventually humans themselves. The divine response is described in detail, absent from the Genesis account. 4 archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, are dispatched on missions of judgment. Raphael receives specific instructions: bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into darkness. Open the desert which is in Dudael and cast him there. Place upon him rough and jagged rocks and cover him with darkness. Let him abide there forever. Cover his face that he may not see light, and on the great day of judgment he shall be cast into the fire. Michael is instructed to bind Semyaza and his associates and imprison them beneath the hills of the earth for 70 generations until the day of great judgment, when they will be led to the abyss of fire. The Nephilim die physically in the flood, but their spirits, being neither fully angelic nor fully human, cannot rest. They become the evil spirits that roam the earth, causing oppression, violence, and corruption. This cosmology provides explanation for demonic activity distinct from the fallen angels themselves. The influence of Enochic literature on Second Temple Judaism was substantial and measurable. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, at least 20 fragmentary copies of Enoch have been identified in Aramaic and Hebrew, more copies than many books that eventually entered the Hebrew canon. The Book of Jubilees, dated to the 2nd century before the Common Era and also preserved at Qumran, incorporates and expands Enochic narratives, presenting them as revelation given to Moses at Mount Sinai alongside the Torah. The New Testament demonstrates clear familiarity with Enochic traditions. The Epistle of Jude, verses 14 and 15, directly quotes, "Enoch, the 7th from Adam, prophesied about them, saying, 'See, the Lord is coming with thousands upon thousands of his holy ones to judge everyone.'" 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 and 5 clearly alludes to the Watchers narrative. God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment. The early Christian community intensely debated Enoch's canonical status. Tertullian in the 2nd century after the Common Era defended it as genuine scripture, arguing that since Jude quoted it, the apostolic authority validated its divine inspiration. Clement of Alexandria in the 3rd century cited it reverentially. However, Jerome in the 4th century rejected its authority, influencing the Western Church's decision to exclude it from the canon. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is the only Christian tradition that maintains Enoch in its canon today, preserving the complete text in Gaia's language. But while the Watchers lay imprisoned beneath the hills awaiting final judgment, another power was establishing itself in the hills of Canaan, a deity whose worship would become synonymous with apostasy and whose name would be twisted by Hebrew scribes into an epithet of contempt and corruption. In 1929, French archaeologists excavating on the Syrian coast uncovered the ruins of ancient Ugarit, a Bronze Age port city destroyed around 1185 before the Common Era. Among the rubble, they discovered a royal archive containing hundreds of clay tablets inscribed with a previously unknown cuneiform alphabet. When epigraphers deciphered these texts during the 1930s, they revealed detailed mythological narratives of the Canaanite populations who inhabited the eastern Mediterranean Levant during the Late Bronze Age. At the center of these narratives stood a figure whose name would echo through millennia: Baal. The term Baal in Northwest Semitic languages was not originally a proper name, but a title meaning lord, master, or owner. It could be applied to multiple deities depending on geographical or functional context. Baal-Hadad, lord of storms and fertility, controlled the rainfall critical for Mediterranean agriculture. Baal-Shamim, lord of heaven, governed the firmament. Baal-Zebul, probably meaning prince lord or exalted lord, was an honorific epithet of the principal deity. The Ugaritic tablets narrate a complex mythological cycle in which Baal battles Yam, personification of chaotic sea waters, and Mot, god of death and aridity. The narrative describes Baal's seasonal death during the dry summer months and his resurrection with autumn rains, a pattern common in agricultural religions that personified natural cycles of dormancy and growth. Baal worship involved elaborate rituals at high places, stone altars where sacrifices were offered, accompanied by practices that later biblical texts would condemn as abominations. When the Israelites emerged as a distinct cultural entity during the transition from late Bronze to early Iron Age, approximately 1200 to 1000 before the Common Era, they found Canaanite Baal worship deeply embedded in every aspect of Mediterranean life. The resulting tension between emerging Yahwistic monotheism and established Canaanite polytheism generates the central narrative conflict of the Hebrew Bible. This was not simply abstract theological disagreement, but existential struggle for cultural identity and religious survival. The prophet Hosea, writing in the 8th century before the Common Era, captures this tension vividly. In chapter 2, verses 13 and 16, God laments that Israel went after her lovers, after the Baals, and forgot me. But a day will come when you will call me my husband, and no longer call me Baal. Even the Hebrew term for husband, which could be Baal in the sense of household lord, had to be abandoned because of its contaminated associations. The conflict reaches dramatic climax during the reign of Ahab, king of Israel between 874 and 853 before the Common Era. His political marriage to Jezebel, Phoenician princess from Sidon, introduced official Baal worship into the Israelite monarchy. 1 Kings chapter 16 verse 31 records that Ahab served Baal and worshipped him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria, capital of the northern kingdom. The confrontation at Mount Carmel, narrated in 1 Kings chapter 18, represents the culminating point of this crisis. The prophet Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to demonstrate their God's power by invoking fire to consume a sacrifice. From morning until noon, they called on the name of Baal, saying, "Baal, answer us." But there was no response. No one answered. They danced around the altar. They shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears as was their custom until blood flowed. The silence of Baal contrasted starkly with the divine fire that immediately consumed Elijah's sacrifice. In 2 Kings chapter 1, we encounter the direct reference that would eventually generate the name Beelzebub. King Ahaziah of Israel, injured after falling through the lattice of his upper room, sent messengers, "Go and consult Baal-Zebub, the god of Ekron, to see if I will recover from this injury." The prophet Elijah intercepted them with sharp rebuke. "Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going off to consult Baal-Zebub, the god of Ekron?" The crucial philological question is whether Baal-Zebub was the original name of the Philistine deity, worshipped at Ekron, or already represented pejorative alteration by Hebrew scribes. Many scholars argue the original name was probably Baal-Zebul, preserved in some traditions, deliberately changed to Baal-Zebub to create mocking wordplay. In Hebrew, Zebub means flies, transforming Prince Lord into Lord of Flies, associating the rival deity with insects that settle on corpses and excrement, symbols of ritual impurity and decomposition. This tactic of name deformation had precedence in Hebrew scribal practice. Names originally containing the element Baal were systematically altered in later texts. Eshbaal became Ishbosheth, substituting Baal with Bosheth, Hebrew word for shame. Meribbaal was renamed Mephibosheth. These alterations reflect deliberate theological campaign to demonize terms associated with rival Canaanite deities. During the Second Temple period, after the return from Babylonian exile in 538 before the Common Era, Judaism developed increasingly sophisticated understanding of demonic hierarchies. Baal-Zebub, carrying centuries of negative connotations, began reinterpretation not merely as false pagan deity, but as genuine demonic entity with real power, albeit subordinate to and opposed to the true God. In the Gospels of the first century after the Common Era, the transformation was complete. Matthew chapter 12, verse 24, records the Pharisees' accusation, "It is only by Beelzebul, the prince of demons, that this fellow drives out demons." The name had completed its metamorphosis from Canaanite storm god to supreme demonic authority. But there was a third name waiting in the shadows of the most ancient manuscripts, a term that began as simple pejorative adjective and ended up embodying the very essence of rebellion against all divine and human order. Among Hebrew terms that underwent dramatic semantic evolution through centuries of theological usage, Belial presents one of the most fascinating transformations. It did not originate as the name of a demonic entity, but as a compound grammatical construction carrying severe moral judgment. The Hebrew word Belial combines Beli, meaning without or not, with Yal, a root connoting worth, profit, or utility. The term literally designated that, or one who is without worth, but carried deeper implication: total rejection of any established moral standard. The Pentateuch employs this expression in revealing contexts. Deuteronomy chapter 13, verses 13 and 14, warns about wicked men, literally sons of Belial, who might arise among the people inciting, "Let us go and serve other gods which you have not known." The context is explicitly apostasy, deliberate abandonment of covenant with the God of Israel. Sons of Belial are not ordinary sinners, but individuals who consciously reject the fundamental covenant that defines Israelite identity. The Book of Judges, probably compiled during the monarchic period between the 10th and 8th centuries before the Common Era, employs the expression repeatedly describing people who embody total moral corruption. Chapter 19, verses 22 to 24, contains one of the most disturbing narratives in all Scripture. When a Levite lodges in Gibeah, a Benjamite city, men of the city, sons of Belial, surround the house demanding the guest be surrendered for sexual abuse. The degeneration is so profound, it precipitates extreme violence and eventually civil war among Israelite tribes. 1 Samuel provides additional illuminating examples. Chapter 2, verses 12 through 17, describes the sons of the priest Eli as sons of Belial, who did not know the Lord. Though occupying sacred positions in the tabernacle, they despised divine offerings, extorted worshippers, and seduced women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. They represent absolute religious corruption, using sacred position to satisfy profane desires without any reverence for the holiness of their office. Chapter 25, verses 3 and 25, identifies Nabal as a man of Belial, characterized by refusal to show hospitality to the future King David and his men. His wife Abigail describes him, "As his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him." The connection between being a son of Belial and rejecting fundamental social obligations like hospitality reveals that the term encompassed not only religious rebellion, but destruction of all ordered social structure. During the Babylonian exile and subsequent Persian period, between 586 and 330 before the Common Era, the concept of Belial begins its transformation from moral descriptor to personified entity. Jewish apocalyptic literature of this period, responding to Persian dualistic influence and existential crises of exile, develops increasingly elaborate cosmologies about conflict between light and darkness, order and chaos, good and evil. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve direct textual evidence of this transformation. The community that produced these manuscripts, probably the Essenes living at Qumran between approximately the 2nd century before the Common Era and 1st century of the Common Era, developed sophisticated dualistic theology in which Belial emerges as central apocalyptic figure. In the War Scroll, one of the most important Qumran texts, Belial is no longer descriptive adjective, but personal commander of forces of darkness in cosmic battle against sons of light, led by the Prince of Light. The text describes elaborate eschatological war lasting 40 years, with specific battles, detailed military strategies, and appropriate liturgies for each phase of conflict. Belial leads the sons of darkness, identified with pagan nations and apostate Israelites, while the Prince of Light, probably the Archangel Michael, commands the sons of light, identified with faithful community members. The document presents not abstract spiritual conflict, but real physical battle that will establish God's kingdom on earth. Another Qumran text, known as the Community Rule or Manual of Discipline, develops this dualistic theology further. It declares that God created humanity to govern the world and appointed for them 2 spirits in which to walk until the time of his visitation. These are the spirits of truth and perversity. From the spring of light come the generations of truth, and from the fountain of darkness all generations of perversity. Belial is identified as the angel of darkness, whose dominion causes the sons of righteousness to go astray. This dualistic theology does not mean the Qumran community believed in 2 equal gods competing for supremacy. The text clarifies that God is supreme sovereign and that conflict between light and darkness has predetermined end, with definitive victory for forces of light. But during this present eon, Belial has real authority over those who chose darkness, and even sons of light face his constant attacks. The New Testament, written during the 1st century after the Common Era, shows clear familiarity with these apocalyptic traditions. The Apostle Paul, in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 15, poses devastating rhetorical question: what harmony is there between Christ and Belial? This is not question about abstract concept, but about personified figure representing everything opposite to Christ. Where Christ establishes order, Belial sows chaos. Where Christ promotes justice, Belial instigates perversion. But how did these 3 figures, Satan the accuser transformed into cosmic adversary, Beelzebub the Canaanite god renamed Prince of Demons, and Belial the moral term elevated to commander of darkness, operate together in Jewish and early Christian apocalyptic imagination? Jewish apocalyptic literature of the intertestamental period did not present systematically organized demonic hierarchies like modern corporate org charts. Different texts, produced by diverse communities in varying historical contexts, employed distinct nomenclatures to designate forces adversarial to the divine. But identifiable patterns emerge when we examine the complete corpus of these writings, revealing how ancient communities attempted to map and comprehend what they perceived as complex spiritual reality. The Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, a pseudepigraphic text probably composed between the 2nd century before the Common Era and 2nd century after the Common Era, though subject to later Christian interpolations, presents Belial as central figure of opposition to the divine. In the Testament of Dan, chapter 5, verses 6 and 7, we read, "Flee from the wrath of Belial, because he gives a sword to those who obey him. The sword is the mother of 7 evils. The text continues listing these evils, beginning with conception in the mind and culminating in the shedding of innocent blood through Belial. In the Testament of Reuben, Belial is associated specifically with sexual seduction and ritual impurity. The text warns that the spirit of Belial operates through fornication to blind the human mind. This functional specialization, where Belial is particularly linked with sexual transgression and breach of ritual purity, contrasts with functions attributed to other adversarial figures in different texts. Jubilees, a text dated approximately to the mid-2nd century before the Common Era and preserved in multiple copies at Qumran, presents cosmology where Satan, also called mastema, meaning hostility or enmity, commands evil spirits but operates within limits established by divine authority. In chapter 10, verses 7 through 9, after the flood, when Noah prays that evil spirits be imprisoned, Mastema intercedes, requesting that 1/10 be left free to execute his power of corruption and deception over the sons of men. This narrative is extraordinarily revealing. Mastema does not act as absolute rebel operating completely outside divine jurisdiction, but as adversary whose very existence and operation are permitted within larger divine economy. God grants the request, establishing that 9/10 of spirits will be imprisoned, while 1/10 remains free under Mastema, his command to test and tempt humanity. This theology preserves absolute divine sovereignty, while explaining the persistence of evil in the post-Diluvian world. The Book of Jubilees also identifies Mastema as responsible for tempting God to command Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Chapter 17, verses 15 and 16 narrates that Mastema came before God and accused Abraham, saying, "Behold, Abraham loves Isaac his son, and he delights in him above all things. Tell him to offer him as a burnt offering on the altar, and you will see if he will do this command." This narrative makes Mastema the instigator of Abraham's test, directly paralleling Satan's role in Job's test. When we examine the New Testament in light of these intertestamental developments, we find interesting synthesis. The Gospels use Satan, devil from Greek diabolos, meaning slanderer or accuser, and Beelzebub apparently as interchangeable designations for supreme demonic authority. In Mark chapter 3, verses 22 through 26, when Jesus is accused of casting out demons by Beelzebub's power, he responds using the name Satan. How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. This terminological fluidity suggests that for New Testament authors, Satan, devil, and Beelzebub were different names for the same reality, the primary adversarial force operating against God's kingdom. Paul uses Belial only once in the already cited 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 15, but employs Satan repeatedly. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 18, he writes, "We wanted to come to you. Certainly I, Paul, did again and again, but Satan blocked our way." The Revelation of John, probably written at the end of the 1st century after the Common Era during Roman imperial persecution, offers the most elaborate New Testament synthesis of these traditions. Chapter 12, verse 9, explicitly identifies the great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth and his angels with him. This passage directly connects the Eden serpent with Satan, devil, and apocalyptic dragon, unifying narratives that in the Genesis text made no such explicit connection. If you are following this investigation to this point, it is because you recognize that understanding how religious concepts evolve through cultural contact and historical crisis does not diminish their meaning, but deepens it. Share this content with someone who also values understanding, not just what ancient texts say, but how and why they say it that way. Revelation continues in chapter 20, verses 1 through 3. describing the millennial imprisonment. I saw an angel coming down out of heaven, having the key to the abyss, and holding in his hand a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. He threw him into the abyss and locked and sealed it over him to keep him from deceiving the nations anymore until the 1,000 years were ended. But the question remains, did these figures operate independently or in hierarchical coordination? And more importantly, how did early Christian communities interpret these forces while facing imperial persecution and attempting to establish identity distinct from both Judaism and Greco-Roman paganism? The transformation of Christianity from persecuted minority to state-sanctioned religion during the 4th century after the Common Era forced dramatic recalibration of Christian demonology. When emperors who had been understood as instruments of demonic opposition suddenly became Christian patrons, theological frameworks required substantial revision. This historical pivot reveals how religious ideas about spiritual warfare are inextricably linked to political and social realities. The Edict of Milan in 313, issued by Emperors Constantine and Licinius, granted religious tolerance throughout the Roman Empire. Constantine's subsequent patronage of Christianity, including funding church construction and intervening in theological disputes, represented seismic shift. Christians who had spent 3 centuries viewing imperial authority as fundamentally opposed to divine purposes now had to reconcile their cosmology with emperors who claimed Christian identity and promoted church interests. Eusebius of Caesarea, Constantine's contemporary and biographer, articulated new theological framework in his Life of Constantine. Eusebius presented Constantine as divinely appointed instrument for establishing Christian empire. The emperor's military victories were interpreted as God vanquishing demonic forces that had previously controlled pagan Rome. In this new paradigm, demonic opposition to Christianity had been decisively defeated through Constantine's conversion, ushering in a new era of Christian triumph. This triumphalist interpretation had profound implications for understanding demonic activity. If the empire was now Christian, where did demons operate? Eusebius and like-minded theologians relocated primary demonic activity to heretics within the church and barbarian peoples outside imperial boundaries. Demons no longer primarily worked through Roman emperors, but through theological deviants and foreign invaders threatening Christian civilization. However, not all Christian thinkers embraced this optimistic recalibration. The desert monastics, particularly in Egypt and Syria, maintained more traditional apocalyptic perspective. They continued viewing the world, including Christianized empire, as fundamentally under demonic influence. Monastic literature from this period describes intensified spiritual warfare, suggesting that demonic forces, losing political control, redirected attacks toward individual Christians through temptation and spiritual deception. The Life of Antony, written by Athanasius around 357, became foundational text for monastic spirituality. Athanasius portrays Antony's desert solitude as combat zone, where demons appear in terrifying forms, attempting to drive him from his ascetic practice through fear, deception, and physical assault. The desert is presented not as retreat from spiritual warfare, but as its primary battleground. By withdrawing from Christianized urban centers into wilderness, monks were advancing into enemy territory, confronting demons in their strongholds. Augustine of Hippo, writing in late 4th and early 5th centuries, offered the most sophisticated and influential patristic synthesis of Christian demonology. In City of God, composed between 413 and 426, in response to Alaric's sack of Rome, Augustine developed comprehensive theology of history as conflict between 2 spiritual cities, the city of God and the city of man. Demons operate not through spectacular supernatural manifestations, but through corrupting human institutions, relationships, and desires. For Augustine, demonic activity is primarily psychological and social, rather than overtly supernatural. Satan works through pride, lust, greed, and other disordered desires that turn humans away from God toward created things. The earthly city, including Christianized Rome, remains mixed community where wheat and tares grow together until final judgment. No human political arrangement, however ostensibly Christian, can be simply identified with God's kingdom or exempted from demonic influence. Augustine's doctrine of original sin complemented his demonology. Humans are born with corrupted nature inherited from Adam's fall, making them inherently vulnerable to demonic temptation. Satan exploits this weakness but cannot force sin. Humans retain freedom to resist temptation through divine grace, but without grace, they inevitably succumb. This framework preserved both human moral responsibility and divine sovereignty while explaining persistent evil in Christianized society. If this historical investigation is revealing how theological ideas emerge from specific historical circumstances and continue evolving in response to changing realities, subscribe to follow this exploration to its conclusion. In his treatise on the Trinity, Augustine argued that demons, despite their power and intelligence, are fundamentally irrational because they have rejected the supreme rationality which is God. Their intelligence is real, but misdirected, capable of sophisticated strategies, but ultimately self-defeating because divorced from truth. This helps explain why demonic activity can appear clever and coordinated, yet ultimately fails to prevent divine purposes. John Cassian, writing in early 5th century based on experiences with Egyptian desert fathers, provided detailed taxonomy of demonic strategies in his conferences and institutes. Cassian identified 8 principal vices through which demons attack monks: gluttony, lust, avarice, anger, sadness, acedia, vainglory, and pride. Each vice has associated demon or group of demons specialized in exploiting particular human weaknesses. This psychological approach to spiritual warfare influenced monastic practice for centuries. But as the Western Roman Empire collapsed under barbarian invasions during the 5th century, Christian thinkers faced new crises: how to understand catastrophic events befalling Christian civilization if demonic forces had supposedly been defeated. The intellectual revolution of the 12th and 13th centuries, often called the medieval Renaissance, transformed European Christianity through recovery of Aristotelian philosophy, establishment of universities, and development of scholastic theology. This period produced unprecedented systematic thinking about demonic nature and activity, culminating in comprehensive frameworks that would shape Western Christianity for centuries. The cathedral schools that evolved into universities at Paris, Oxford, Bologna, and elsewhere created institutional structures for sustained theological inquiry. Masters like Peter Abelard pioneered dialectical method, applying logical analysis to inherited doctrines. When Peter Lombard compiled his sentences around 1150, collecting authoritative statements from scripture and church fathers on systematic topics, he established a textbook that generations of theology students would study and commentate upon. Lombard's section on demons addressed inherited questions systematically. He affirmed that demons retain natural powers as intellectual beings, but deployed them perversely. They could manipulate physical matter, influence human imagination, and tempt toward sin, but could not force free will, perform genuine miracles, or know hidden thoughts. This framework attempted to preserve both demonic real power and divine sovereignty while protecting human moral responsibility. The recovery of Aristotelian natural philosophy through Arabic translations and commentaries, particularly works of Avicenna and Averroes, provided conceptual tools for more sophisticated analysis of demonic nature. Aristotle's metaphysics distinguished substance from accidents, form from matter, act from potency. His psychology analyzed sensation, imagination, intellect, and will. These categories enabled unprecedented precision in discussing how purely spiritual beings like demons could interact with material world and human psychology. Albert the Great, writing in mid-13th century, applied Aristotelian natural philosophy comprehensively to theological questions. In his commentary on Lombard sentences and independent works on creation, Albert developed detailed theory of angelic and demonic knowledge, power, and interaction with physical reality. Angels and demons possessed intellectual knowledge more perfect than human rational knowledge, but less comprehensive than divine omniscience. They understood universal principles immediately, but learned particular facts through investigation. Thomas Aquinas, Albert's most famous student, synthesized Christian theology and Aristotelian philosophy in monumental Summa Theologiae, composed between 1265 and 1274. Aquinas dedicated extensive questions to angels and demons, applying his characteristic analytical method. For Aquinas, demons were purely spiritual substances without material bodies. Their intellects operated without dependence on sensory information, grasping essences directly. However, their wills were irrevocably fixed in rejection of God following their initial choice to sin. Aquinas argued that demons could not perform true miracles, which by definition transcend natural causal powers, but could produce effects appearing miraculous through superior knowledge of natural causation. A demon might manipulate weather patterns, induce vivid hallucinations through affecting brain chemistry, or transport objects rapidly, all without violating natural laws, but using knowledge and power far exceeding human capabilities. This preserved both reality of dramatic demonic manifestations reported in hagiographical literature and philosophical principle that only God transcends natural order. The Scholastic framework emphasized demonic limitations alongside powers. Demons could not read thoughts directly, only infer mental states from external behaviors. They could not force human will, only present temptations making sin attractive. They could not create life or restore it after death. Their knowledge, though vast, was discursive rather than intuitive, requiring reasoning from premises to conclusions. These limitations preserved divine uniqueness and human autonomy, while acknowledging real demonic threats. If this investigation is revealing how medieval theologians balanced inherited traditions with philosophical rigor, creating frameworks that attempted to make coherent sense of diverse scriptural and experiential claims about spiritual warfare, share this content with others who appreciate intellectual history. Bonaventure, Aquinas' Franciscan contemporary, offered alternative approach emphasizing mystical and affective dimensions over purely intellectual analysis. For Bonaventure, understanding demons required not just philosophical categories, but spiritual discernment, cultivated through prayer and contemplation. Demons operated primarily through corrupting love, disordering human affections so that created goods were loved excessively while the Creator was loved deficiently or not at all. Duns Scotus, writing around 1300, challenged aspects of Thomistic synthesis. Scotus emphasized will over intellect in both human and angelic psychology. For Scotus, Lucifer's sin was primarily volitional pride rather than intellectual error. This had practical implications. Resisting demonic temptation required not just correct understanding, but disciplined will, choosing good despite contrary desires. Scotus's voluntarism influenced later Franciscan theology and eventually Protestant reformers. William of Ockham, early 14th century, applied nominalist philosophy questioning whether universal categories had real existence. For Occam, theological speculation should be limited to what Scripture and Church explicitly taught. Many scholastic elaborations about demonic hierarchies, specific powers, and detailed cosmologies went beyond biblical warrant and should be held tentatively as probable opinions rather than certain doctrine. This skepticism toward speculative theology would intensify during Reformation. But even as university theologians refined philosophical frameworks, developments in pastoral practice and popular religion were moving in directions that would produce one of Christianity's darkest chapters: the systematic persecution of alleged witches accused of diabolical conspiracy. The machinery of persecution was assembled piece by piece across 2 centuries. Inquisitorial procedures refined for heresy, theological frameworks establishing real demonic power, legal precedents authorizing judicial torture, social trauma from plague, famine, and war creating desperate need for explanations. Popular superstitions about malevolent magic systematized into elaborate conspiracy theories. All these elements converged in the late 15th century, creating a perfect storm that would devastate communities for the next 200 years. The publication of Malleus Maleficarum in 1484 provided the catalyst. Heinrich Kramer, Dominican inquisitor, had recently been expelled from Innsbruck after his overzealous witch prosecutions were condemned by local bishop as excessive. Humiliated and determined to vindicate his methods, Kramer compiled a comprehensive treatise arguing that witch persecution was not just legitimate, but theologically mandatory. The book was presented with forged papal approval, giving it appearance of official endorsement it did not actually possess. The Malleus systematized fragmented beliefs about witchcraft into coherent demonological framework. It cited Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, and other respected theologians to argue that denying reality of witchcraft contradicted Scripture and church teaching. Since Bible commanded that witches not be suffered to live, executing convicted witches was divine imperative. Merciful leniency toward witches meant condemning innocent Christians to demonic attacks. Part 1 of the Malleus established theological foundations, arguing that witches gained real supernatural powers through pacts with demons. Part 2 provided detailed taxonomy of maleficia, harmful magic witches supposedly performed, causing impotence, sterility, miscarriages, infant deaths, crop failures, storms, livestock diseases. Part 3 outlined legal procedures for identifying, interrogating, and prosecuting witches, including graduated application of torture to extract confessions. Particularly sinister was Malleus's focus on women as primary witchcraft suspects. The text argued that women were intellectually inferior, morally weaker, and carnally more insatiable than men, making them preferred targets for demonic recruitment. This theological misogyny transformed existing social vulnerabilities into legal persecution. Widows, spinsters, midwives, healers, quarrelsome women, or simply those who failed to conform to gender expectations became suspects. Gutenberg's printing press, revolutionary invention of mid-15th century, enabled unprecedented dissemination. Between 1487 and 1520, Malleus went through at least 13 editions. It was reprinted repeatedly during 16th and 17th centuries. Judges, both ecclesiastical and secular, consulted Malleus as authority when conducting witch trials. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation intensified rather than diminished persecutions. Protestant reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin affirmed reality of demonic conspiracy and necessity of executing witches. Luther declared the devil real and active, constantly seeking to corrupt faithful. Calvin's Geneva prosecuted witches as vigorously as Catholic territories. Theological divisions over salvation, sacraments, and authority did not extend to shared conviction that Satan operated through human agents who must be eliminated. The Council of Trent, Catholic Church's response to Protestant Reformation between 1545 and 1563 reaffirmed traditional teachings, including reality of demonic activity. Both Protestant and Catholic territories conducted witch trials, competing to demonstrate their superior dedication to combating satanic infiltration. Religious warfare that devastated Europe during 16th and 17th centuries occurred alongside intensifying witch persecutions. Legal procedures developed by Inquisition were adapted by secular courts across Europe. The accusatorial system, where accuser risked penalty if accusation proved false, gave way to inquisitorial system, where state-initiated prosecutions based on rumor or suspicion. Torture was authorized to obtain confessions. Accused witches faced impossible dilemma: maintain innocence and face prolonged torture, or confess and face execution. Most chose confession to end suffering. Confessions extracted under torture provided evidence confirming conspiracy theories. Accused witches, desperate to stop pain, repeated whatever interrogators suggested. They confessed to flying to Sabbaths, copulating with demons, desecrating sacraments, and causing disasters. They named accomplices, implicating neighbors, and triggering cascades of accusations. Each confession seemed to validate the reality of organized satanic conspiracy, justifying further prosecutions. The geography of persecution was uneven. Some regions conducted few witch trials, while others experienced concentrated panics. The Holy Roman Empire, politically fragmented into hundreds of territories with varying legal systems, saw particularly intense prosecutions. The prince-bishoprics of Bamberg and Würzburg, ruled by zealous Catholic bishops, conducted mass trials executing hundreds. Switzerland, both Catholic and Protestant cantons, prosecuted vigorously. Scotland, under Presbyterian Kirk, conducted systematic hunts. We stand now at the threshold of history's darkest intersection between theological conviction and judicial violence. What follows in the next parts is not hypothetical scenario, but documented reality. Tens of thousands executed based on tortured confessions. Communities torn apart by mutual accusations, and collaboration between religious and secular authorities in systematic persecution lasting centuries. The archives do not allow denial. Municipal records from German prince-bishoprics, ecclesiastical court proceedings from Switzerland, Kirk session minutes from Scotland, assize records from England. They survived centuries in basements and libraries, preserved on vellum and paper written in Latin, German, French, English, Scots. The handwriting is often beautiful, elegant script recording unspeakable acts with bureaucratic precision. Names, ages, accusations, confession texts, torture methods employed, execution dates, notarized, sealed, witnessed. Bamberg, under Prince Bishop Johann Georg II, Fuchs von Dornheim, between 1623 and 1633, represents persecution at its most systematic. Approximately 600 executions in city of 6,000 inhabitants over decade. 1/10 of entire population burned alive. The victims included the Prince Bishop's own chancellor, his personal physician, the burgomasters of multiple districts, and children as young as 9 years old. The chancellor's letter, smuggled from prison hours before his execution, survived hidden in family documents discovered centuries later. Written in German, it describes torture in clinical detail. The strappado dislocated both shoulders. The leg vices crushed bones that never healed properly. Application of burning sulfur to armpits produced agony beyond description. Under such torment, he confessed to attending Sabbaths he never attended, copulating with demons who never existed, renouncing Christ whom he continued to worship. The letter's final lines: "I die innocent. God, who is truth, knows it." Würzburg conducted even more intensive persecution under Prince Bishop Philipp Adolf von Ehrenberg. Between 1627 and 1629, 900 executions. The court records list victims by occupation: nobles, priests, children, town councillors, judges. 29 executions occurred in single day during August 1629. Special burning chambers were constructed to handle volume, the efficiency of industrial-scale killing refined through practice. Scotland's witch hunts, operated under Presbyterian Kirk, convinced that Satan actively sought Scotland's destruction. King James VI personally attended torture sessions, believing royal presence would force demons to flee, allowing genuine confessions. His Demonology, published 1597, provided theological justification for systematic hunting. The text argued that witches must be discovered and destroyed as enemies of God's kingdom. The North Berwick trials, 1590, illustrate political paranoia fueling persecutions. When storms threatened James's voyage with his bride from Denmark, he blamed witchcraft. Over 70 people were eventually tortured and executed for allegedly conspiring through magic to assassinate the king. The Confessions, extracted using thumbscrews and other devices, described elaborate Sabbaths where participants supposedly plotted royal murder. England experienced less intensive persecution than Continent or Scotland, but significant panics occurred. Matthew Hopkins, self-styled witchfinder general, operated in East Anglia between 1645 and 1647 during English Civil War chaos. Hopkins travelled between villages offering services, identifying witches for fee. His methods included sleep deprivation, forced walking until collapse, and water tests. He claimed responsibility for over 300 executions in 2 years. Swimming test exemplified perverse logic. Accused women were bound thumbs to opposite toes and thrown into water. If they floated, water rejected them as Satan's servants, proving guilt. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent but dead. Either outcome confirmed system's validity to believers. The Basque witch trials, 1609 to 1614, show rare example of skeptical intervention. Spanish Inquisitor Alonso de Salazar Frias investigated witchcraft accusations systematically. He discovered that confessions contained contradictions and impossibilities. Children had been coached to testify against parents. Accusations served personal vendettas. Salazar's report to Suprema concluded that evidence was insufficient, recommending leniency. His intervention likely prevented thousands of executions. But Salazar was exceptional. Most inquisitors, magistrates, and ministers genuinely believed in satanic conspiracy requiring violent response. They were not cynical manipulators, but true believers, convinced they defended Christianity against existential threat. This makes the horror more comprehensible, but no less devastating. Salem, Massachusetts, 1692, demonstrates that New World was not immune. 19 hangings, 1 pressing death, 5 prison deaths, over 150 imprisoned. The panic began with adolescent girls displaying seizures attributed to demonic possession. Accusations cascaded through community, following patterns established by European precedents. Crucially, Salem occurred after European hunts had largely ceased, showing how witch panic could resurge under appropriate conditions of social stress and theological conviction. Conservative historical estimates suggest 40,000 to 60,000 executions between 1450 and 1750. Approximately 80% were women. Most were poor, elderly, socially marginal. But as Bamberg and Würzburg demonstrated, when hunts reached frenzy, neither wealth nor social position guaranteed safety. Here is truth that burns through centuries. This was not aberration perpetrated by exceptional monsters. It was logical application of theological premises about real demonic power, combined with legal procedures authorizing torture, executed by religious and secular authorities, convinced they defended Christendom against existential satanic conspiracy. The perpetrators were ordinary people operating within systems that validated violence as justice. Voices of dissent emerged gradually, initially whispering privately before daring to speak publicly. Friedrich Spee von Langenfeld, Jesuit priest assigned as confessor to women condemned for witchcraft in Würzburg and neighboring territories, accompanied over 200 women to their executions. He heard true confessions whispered when torturers were absent. He witnessed absolute innocence of dozens led to flames. The experience devastated Spee. Fellow Jesuits commented that his hair had turned prematurely white, not from age, but from psychological trauma of accompanying innocents to death, knowing he could do nothing to save them. In 1631, he published anonymously Cautio Criminalis, Warning on Criminal Procedures, the first systematic and theologically grounded challenge to witch hunts. The text methodically attacked every element of witchcraft procedures. Torture produced only false confessions, not truth. Cascading accusations resulted from desperate people trying to end suffering by naming anyone. Witchfinders were charlatans finding evidence where none existed. Judges frequently had financial motivations since condemned persons' properties were confiscated. The entire system was judicial monstrosity without legitimate biblical or theological foundation. Crucially, Spee did not deny reality of witchcraft itself. He acknowledged that demons existed and could influence humans. But he argued that methods employed to identify and punish witches were completely flawed, producing only massive injustice. This distinction was vital. Denying witchcraft's existence would be heretical and result in his own execution. But questioning specific procedures remained within acceptable theological boundaries. Other dissenters had preceded Spee. Johann Weyer, Dutch physician, had published in 1563 De Praestigiis Demonum on demonic illusions, arguing that many accused of witchcraft were elderly women suffering from melancholy or mental illness. Reginald Scott, Englishman, published in 1584 The Discovery of Witchcraft, exposing conjurers' tricks and questioning whether supernatural witchcraft really existed. These voices were initially marginal, frequently condemned by authorities. King James I of England ordered all copies of Scott's book burned. Weyer was denounced by demonologists as heretical or possibly himself a witch. But gradually, especially after devastation of 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648, judicial fatigue and economic calculation began weighing against continued persecutions. Executing large segments of productive population was economically destructive. In regions where hunts had been most intense, resulting depopulation caused agricultural and commercial collapse. Würzburg and Bamberg needed generations to recover lost population and prosperity. Infinite cascades of accusations overloaded judicial systems to point of paralysis. The Enlightenment of 18th century, with emphasis on reason, empirical evidence, and skepticism towards superstition, created intellectual climate where witchcraft procedures seemed increasingly barbaric and irrational. Christian Thomasius, German jurist, published in 1701 dissertation arguing that witchcraft trials violated fundamental legal principles and should be abolished. Voltaire, French philosopher, denounced witch hunts as examples of religious fanaticism and judicial barbarity. In his philosophical dictionary, Voltaire wrote mordantly about absurdity of procedures where torture guaranteed confession, confession guaranteed guilt, and guilt guaranteed execution. He argued that any person under sufficient torture would confess impossible crimes. Gradually, European states began abolishing witchcraft laws. Prussia, under Frederick the Great, abolished capital punishment for witchcraft in 1740. France effectively ended persecutions during mid-18th century. Austria, under Maria Theresa, abolished witchcraft laws in 1766. England repealed Witchcraft Act in 1736, replacing it with law, penalizing pretense of supernatural powers as fraud. The last execution for witchcraft in Western Europe occurred in Switzerland in 1782. Anna Goldie, domestic servant accused of poisoning her employer's child, was beheaded after confession under torture. But even then, Swiss authorities recognized accusation was dubious and kept trial secret to avoid public criticism. 2 centuries of systematic persecution had finally ended, not through theological revelation, but through exhaustion, cultural change, and belated recognition of fundamental injustice. But what do these hunts reveal about human nature, about how theological systems interact with judicial power, about capacity of ordinary people to commit atrocities while convinced they serve divine justice? The devastating truth is that while theologians debated demonic hierarchies and philosophers discussed nature of evil, the genuine horror was not in supernatural realms, but in human hearts capable of inflicting systematic suffering in the name of religious purity. The most terrifying demons did not possess wings or horns. They wore judicial robes and carried theological manuals. The 3 names that began this investigation, Lucifer, Beelzebub, Belial, had evolved through millennia, from functional descriptions to personified forces to elaborate hierarchies. But the real power of these concepts lay not in whatever supernatural realities they might represent, but in how human institutions deployed them to justify violence, enforce conformity, and eliminate those deemed threatening to social order. So we arrive at the heart of this investigation, the question that should have been asked from the beginning. Where were Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Belial during the witch hunts? If these 3 principalities truly commanded demonic hierarchies warring against humanity, why did genuine horror come not from supernatural realms, but from ecclesiastical courts and torture chambers operated by humans? The answer reveals something profoundly disturbing about how theological concepts evolve and are instrumentalized. The 3 names we investigated did not emerge as fully formed revealed doctrine. Each had documentable historical trajectory through ancient texts, cultural influences, and traceable theological developments. Satan, the functional accuser in Book of Job, transformed into Satan, cosmic adversary, through centuries of interpretation influenced by Persian dualism and Jewish apocalyptic literature. Baal-Zebul, Canaanite deity, was deliberately deformed by Hebrew scribes into Baal-Zebub, Lord of Flies, in mocking theological polemic. Belial evolved from descriptive term for morally worthless people into personified apocalyptic figure in Dead Sea Scrolls. During 13th through 17th centuries, when scholastic theologians systematized these concepts into elaborate hierarchies, attributing specific powers and distinct functions to different classes of demons, something crucial was forgotten. These categories were human constructs attempting to organize and comprehend experiences of evil, suffering, and temptation. They were not revealed architectural blueprints of infernal realm. Malleus Maleficarum cited Thomas Aquinas and other respected theologians to justify witch persecution. But Aquinas never advocated systematic hunts or judicial torture to extract confessions. Philosophical sophistication about angelic nature was divorced from original context and deployed to validate atrocity. Theology was transformed into weapon. Here is devastating irony. While Catholic and Protestant authorities burned tens of thousands for supposedly conspiring with Satan, they demonstrated human capacity for systematic evil exceeding any alleged demonic conspiracy. Accusers, torturers, judges, and spectators applauding executions were not possessed by supernatural forces. They were ordinary people operating within systems that validated cruelty as justice. Friedrich Spee had perceived this. In Cautio Criminalis, he not only criticized flawed procedures, but implicitly questioned whether witch hunting revealed more about human than diabolic wickedness. If torture produced only false confessions, and false confessions led to execution of innocents, then true agents of evil were not alleged witches, but the judicial system itself. This perception gradually penetrated European consciousness during Enlightenment, not because theologians revised doctrines about demons, but because thinkers began questioning whether attributing catastrophes to supernatural agencies was adequate explanation when natural causes and human action sufficed. When Voltaire ridiculed witch hunts, he was not defending alternative theology about demonic nature. He was applying skeptical reason to entire framework. Abolition of witchcraft laws did not result from theological change about whether demons existed. It resulted from recognition that procedures employed to identify and punish supposed demonic collaborators were fundamentally unjust and produced massive suffering without corresponding benefit. It was pragmatic calculation, not spiritual revelation. What does this mean for the three names that initiated this investigation? It means their power never resided primarily in whatever supernatural reality they might represent. Their power lay in how human institutions deployed them to categorize enemies, justify violence, and enforce conformity. Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Belial functioned as conceptual categories through which communities identified and eliminated deviants. This does not resolve philosophical or theological question about whether evil possesses supernatural dimension. Religious communities continue maintaining diverse beliefs about nature of adversarial spiritual forces. But what history documents unequivocally is that regardless of whatever supernatural realities may or may not exist, humans are perfectly capable of creating earthly hells without demonic assistance. The pyres were lit by human hands, the sentences were pronounced by human voices, the tortures were designed by human minds, and justifications were constructed through human theologies that, however philosophically sophisticated, served to validate atrocity as divine justice. The names Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Belial traveled through millennia, accumulating meanings, transforming from functional descriptions to personified entities to elaborate hierarchies. But their true power was always human, the power to name evil, categorize it, and then use those categories to justify violence against those deemed threats to social and religious order. When we ask whether three demons rule hierarchies of darkness, we miss more important question. Why did belief in such hierarchies facilitate systematic persecution of vulnerable populations? The answer lies not in supernatural realm, but in how religious authority structures interact with political power, social anxieties, and human capacity for justified violence. After traversing 3 millennia of textual, theological, and human history, we arrive not at definitive answers, but at deeper understanding of correct questions. Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Belial are not figures that emerged fully formed from Scripture's pages with clearly delineated demonic hierarchies and specific functions assigned by divine revelation. They are constructs that evolved through successive layers of interpretation, each generation adding meanings while responding to specific crises, particular fears, and theological needs of their time. Isaiah's Hellel ben Shachar, morning star fallen, was originally political metaphor about Babylonian king. Only centuries later, through apocalyptic lenses and influence of texts like Enoch, was this image reinterpreted as narrative of primordial angelic rebellion. Baal-Zebul underwent even more deliberate transformation, rival deity's name intentionally distorted in mockery by scribes preserving sacred texts. Belial traveled trajectory from common adjective for morally worthless people to personified apocalyptic entity commanding darkness forces in Qumran manuscripts. Each transformation is documentable, traceable, comprehensible within historical and cultural context. What this tells us is not that these concepts lack meaning, but that their meaning was always shaped by human communities attempting to name, categorize, and comprehend forces they perceived as opposed to good, justice, and sacred. Medieval scholastic systematization, however philosophically sophisticated, represented not discovery of pre-existing infernal structures, but human attempt to impose rational order upon chaotic experiences of evil and suffering. Thomas Aquinas applied Aristotelian categories to angelic and demonic nature with impressive rigor, carefully distinguishing between angelic knowledge and human knowledge, between natural power of demons and supernatural grace, between capacity to influence and capacity to force will. But these distinctions, however philosophically refined, were speculative, acknowledged as such even in his time. When Malleus Maleficarum cited Aquinas and other theologians to justify witch hunts, it was doing something Aquinas never intended, transforming theological reflection into judicial persecution program. Intellectual sophistication was deployed to validate atrocity, and tens of thousands died, not because demons possessed them, but because human power systems needed enemies to eliminate and theologies to justify elimination. Confessions extracted under torture followed scripts provided by interrogators using demonological manuals as screenplay. When multiple victims confessed similar details about satanic Sabbaths, this did not prove reality of demonic conspiracy, only demonstrated that sufficient torture makes people repeat any suggested narrative to end suffering. True horror of witch hunts does not lie in revealing power of Lucifer, Beelzebub, or Belial, but in demonstrating terrifying human capacity to inflict systematic evil while convinced of serving absolute good. But this leads us to deeper and more disturbing question. If the three names functioned primarily as categories through which communities identified and eliminated perceived threats, does this mean concepts of supernatural evil are entirely social constructs without real referent? Here we must be careful and honest. This historical investigation documents how concepts about adversarial forces evolved through traceable human processes. It documents how these concepts were instrumentalized to justify institutional violence. But documenting human processes of conceptual construction does not necessarily resolve ontological questions about whether evil possesses dimension that transcends human. Religious communities in good faith continue maintaining diverse beliefs about nature of spiritual reality, some affirming existence of personal adversarial forces, others understanding evil as absence of good rather than positive power, still others interpreting demonological language as metaphor for psychological tendencies and oppressive social structures. What we can affirm with certainty, based on incontestable historical evidence, is that regardless of whatever supernatural realities may or may not exist, humans have demonstrated consistent capacity to create massive suffering without need for demonic assistance. Pyres were lit by human decisions. Sentences were pronounced by human authorities. Justifications were constructed through human theological systems. So where does this leave us? Perhaps with recognition that questioning how religious concepts evolve and are deployed does not diminish possible transcendent dimension of spiritual experience, but makes us more responsible about how we use religious language. If Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Belial functioned historically as categories to identify enemies and justify violence, then any contemporary invocation of these names or similar concepts should come with awareness of that legacy and vigilance against repeating patterns where theology legitimates oppression. The genuine spiritual battle, if such thing exists, may be less about identifying supernatural agents and more about resisting universal human temptations. Temptation of absolute certainty that dispenses with compassion, temptation to divide world into pure and impure without recognizing moral ambiguity, temptation to use sacred language to validate violence against vulnerable. Names change through millennia, but patterns remain recognizable. Genuine vigilance against evil, whether conceived as supernatural force or human tendency, requires not merely naming external enemies, but examining systems we create and roles we play in them. This is less satisfying conclusion than clearly delineated demonic hierarchies, but perhaps it is more truthful and certainly more useful for preventing repetition of historical horrors documented in this investigation. This investigation traversed 3 millennia, not to provide simple answers about demonic hierarchies, but to reveal something more fundamental: how religious concepts about evil evolve through documentable human processes, responding to historical crises, cultural influences, and theological needs of specific communities. The 3 names we explored, Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Belial, carry layers of meaning accumulated through centuries of interpretation, each layer reflecting particular concerns of its time. What makes this story simultaneously fascinating and disturbing is recognizing that while theologians debated nature of adversarial spiritual forces with impressive philosophical sophistication, practical applications of these concepts frequently resulted not in greater holiness or spiritual protection, but in massive human suffering. Witch hunts were not aberrations perpetrated by exceptionally evil people, but logical applications of theological premises about real demonic power, combined with judicial procedures authorizing torture executed by religious and secular authorities, convinced they were defending Christendom against existential threat. This is not story about abandoning spiritual concerns or dismissing religious traditions as merely social constructions. It is story about need for critical vigilance regarding how we use religious language, especially when that language identifies enemies and justifies violence against them. If names like Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Belial functioned historically to categorize and eliminate those deemed threats to religious and social order, then any contemporary invocation of similar concepts should come accompanied by awareness of that legacy and commitment not to repeat oppressive patterns. True spiritual challenge may be less about identifying malignant supernatural forces operating externally and more about recognizing universal human tendencies that manifest evil in the world. Absolute certainty that dispenses with compassion, rigid divisions between pure and impure that ignore moral ambiguity, use of sacred language to validate violence against vulnerable. These patterns remain recognizable through millennia, merely changing names and theological justifications while producing similar suffering. If this content expanded your understanding of how religious doctrines developed through complex historical processes, like this video so the algorithm shows it to more people interested in serious intellectual history. Comment sharing which aspect of this investigation most challenged your previous perspectives or what questions remain for you. Share with someone who appreciates rigorous historical analysis of religious topics without sensationalist simplifications. Save for future reference, especially if you study theology, medieval history, or development of religious doctrines. Subscribe to the channel for future investigations that treat religious and historical topics with intellectual seriousness, academic rigor, and honesty about complexities and ambiguities.